Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 5, Episode 8, presented by Marketile. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
And Steve, you're back, or you never left. You're in my backyard again.
Still, I have not left.
Have not left. A little bit of R&R for both of us. So, a very special episode. It is an encore episode as we go back in the vast catalog of our podcasts.
We're going deep into, we took the elevator down 5 levels to the subterranean vault that houses Season 1.
Season 1, which is
Remarkable Retail Podcast.
Which is, I think, the numbers are, we continue to get listens from all seasons, actually. It's really interesting to watch the numbers. And when we started talking about the idea of an encore episode, you immediately came to one of the episodes in Season 1 that really kind of deserves, if not more airplay, because it's already had lots of airplay. It really is an anchor episode. Talk about the one that you
Yeah, so for newer listeners, Season 1, we essentially walked through each chapter of my book, Remarkable Retail, sometimes with guests, sometimes with not. And this particular episode is the one called Choose Remarkable, which is where I kind of pivot and make really the case for why very good is not good enough anymore and kind of set up some of the principles for the rest of the book. So it'll be a reminder for some of them, but other people will be new material. And we're going to take a little time off, and you get to hear and compare how much, at least I've improved. Michael's always been good, but I think my on-air performance is a little bit better. Yeah,
so it's bound to sound a little different. We got new tech from both of us, but it is one of those key foundational. The whole first season was a key foundational season. So let's go back in the back catalog. Now, before we get to that, let's hear from our presenting sponsor. Marketile's easy-to-use testing platform emboldens great decisions, leading to reliable, scalable results. With Marketile, you can be confident in the outcome of your in-store pilot initiatives before rolling them out across your fleet. In a challenging retail climate of supply chain disruption, labor shortages, and dynamic customer behavior, the need for reliable insights has never been greater. Validate your remarkable ideas with Marketile's in-store testing solution. The proof is in the testing. Learn more at Marketile.com. That's Marketile.com. Let's first of all go back into the core principles. So, without getting too far in, tell us what, in your mind, are those core concepts of the book, those core principles that people should have, keep in mind and have handy and really provide, again, the framework for understanding the 8 essentials.
I probably won't cover all of them, but really what I tried to do in part 1 of the book was make the case that you have to choose remarkable. And some of the underlying reasons for that, or just what you had to understand for me to try to get you to that conclusion, is first of all, there's been this epic revolution across really the last 15 or 20 years where technology's accelerated, consumer behavior has changed radically. The various forces of competition have really been upended. And of course, all of this has been made even more dire, complex, accelerated, whatever you want to say it, by the pandemic. So we have a world that's been turned upside down, and we have all these forces that have been at play for a while, dramatically accelerated. As it relates to the retail playing field, I guess, you and I have been, I think, as well as others, been fighting a little bit of this retail apocalypse narrative. But certainly there's been a big reset in the amount of retail space still going on. Some of that is due to overbuilding. Some of that is because certain categories like apparel and department stores have been very, very challenged. And so we've seen this so-called collapse of the middle among unremarkable retail formats. We've seen a lot of shifts in terms of retailer wholesale relationships. Just in general, I think kind of a bifurcation of outcomes among different income classes and wealth classes and so forth. The other thing that I think is definitely a big part of the book, and we'll certainly talk about more as we go forward, is this idea of the blurring of the lines between shopping channels, that the distinction between e-commerce and brick and mortar is really not much of a difference in most cases, and that we have to think about it as all commerce and that the customer is the channel. And that's, again, been accelerated by the pandemic, but it's been there for a while. And I think the retailers that are performing better really embraced that notion a few years ago. probably the last one I'll mention for now is trying to disabuse folks of the notion that you can cost cut or store close your way to prosperity. That's not to say that you shouldn't close stores or
adjust the fleet or do whatever.
Everybody's
lots of decisions. We were just talking off mic about in Toronto. I was looking at a statistic, and this I'm sure reflects itself in many major urban cities with lots of workforces that come and go into a downtown or a core. There's something like 400,000 people in the Toronto area that come into the downtown core, service people, workers, and now that's at 10%. 10% of that volume today. Now it's probably not going to stay at 10%, but it's hard to see it going back to 100% post-COVID. And then what does that mean? Like, as you said, you're probably going to need less stores downtown. I mean, that's not a improve my brand situation. That's just the day-to-day, where should my stores be and how big should they be and all those kind of things, right?
Yeah, and I know we touched on this a little bit with the last episode, that I think generally what we've seen is that if you're closing a lot of stores or finding that you have to really gut your cost structure, not in response to the pandemic, but that's been a path you've been on for a while, which is certainly true of dozens of retailers we could probably name off the top of our head. If that's the path you've been on, it's probably the case that you have a brand relevance and differentiation problem, much more so than you have a cost problem. It's just you haven't figured out how to grow share of wallet and market share, and you basically have run out of options. That's largely a downward spiral if we don't fundamentally figure out how to become more remarkable. So as I try to land the plane, so to speak, at the end of part one, what I'm trying to drive towards is this idea that even very good is not good enough anymore when consumers have so many choices at their disposal, so much information, so many ready substitutes essentially for the vast amount of things that they're buying. And so it really puts pressure on retailers and brands to up their game, to be, as I say, remarkable. And I think I think it was certainly pretty clear pre-pandemic that this was becoming much more of an imperative. But I think as we come out, and hopefully more or less we start to come out in the not too distant future, as we come out of this, the playing field will be reset in a lot of cases because of store closings and bankruptcies and shifting consumer behavior. But still, it's going to be the case that in most places, you're going to have a lot of competition and a lot of the power will rest with the consumer. And you still have to figure out how to be that signal amidst all the noise and create a story for customers that they'll want to spread.
So along those same lines, flipping through one of those chapters, you talk about the idea that it's later than you think. Basically, I used to have this saying with my team. It was more tongue in cheek than real, but every now and then it was real. It says, "Listen, it's never too early to panic." Not that we panicked a lot on a day-to-day basis, but as you say, the time is always later than you think, and to provide some context for that, you provide the readers and the listeners you'll provide the listeners here with some questions, 5 or 4 questions that they should be asking themselves about their business as we kind of transition into the 8 essentials. Then I'm going to ask you just to kind of briefly go over the 8 essentials and help me understand the difference between differentiators and table stakes. But what are the 4 things that retailers should be keeping in mind as they think about part 2?
Well, before I do that, there's a quote that I have in the book that I love, which is from Carlos Castaneda in his book, Journey to Ixtlan, where he says, the problem is you think you have time. And I think, again, pre-pandemic, there are plenty of examples of companies that I don't know if they thought they had enough time to catch up or what, but clearly the customer, the world has gotten away from them. And I think that is a function of disruption happening faster and faster all the time. But what I try to frame up as we wrap up part 1 are these 4 questions, which I suggest that people keep in mind broadly as they think about their strategies, and in particular if they're reading the book. The first is, could the pace of disruption be about to hit your business even harder and more profoundly than you currently can imagine? And again, as we've talked about a bunch of times, I wrote this book before the pandemic, so I didn't have a pandemic in mind. So
in the simple halcyon days of pre-pandemic, we just had a retail apocalypse to deal with.
Exactly. So
boy, we'll look back fondly on those days.
Yeah. So I really couldn't imagine some of what's transpired. But I think, again, as things hopefully recover a bit, I think these questions will still be important. The second one is, could your current value proposition not be nearly remarkable enough to fight and win in the future? This gets a little bit to something I've said many times, which is making sure that you're not just a slightly better version of mediocre or comfortable that even being very good is really good enough anymore. The third is, could your organization not be changing significantly or quickly enough? And I think one of the things we've seen is, and this is not an original point, that a lot of innovation is hampered by a culture, lack of processes around innovation, funding, those sort of things. I think what the COVID-19 crisis has taught us, again, something I think that was there, but even more important now, is just how you need to build agility into your business model.
Comment on that, as I've been talking to business leaders, is they never realized how agile they could actually be. Decisions, thousands of decisions that needed to be made in a pretty quick amount of time, but a straightforward one that seems to have surprised many is how quickly they could pivot to having all their employees that could work at home.
Right.
And many of them, I talked to one retailer and they struggled for years with this, pros and cons, and then it was done in a week.
Yeah.
And so it feels like in some ways you get in your own way, but that was one of the things that they remarked upon.
Yeah.
Was, wow, we really can be this agile. I wonder how we can capture that lesson and apply it against other things.
Well, once again, is right. The problem is they think they have time. And I think it's really easy to, as we've touched on a few times already, to defend the status quo or be the Department of No or whatever, all these ideas we've talked about that keep companies from being innovative. But when a crisis hits, a real crisis with so much urgency, it's not so hard for people to take action. I think the broader strategy question, it's great that if we learn what to do in the event of another global pandemic, hopefully that won't happen again. I think the real question is, how do you deal with a slow motion crisis? Because every company that was in trouble before the pandemic, or just about every company, I'm sure somebody will point out an exception, but JCPenney, right? That has been a slow motion crisis. They've been in crisis for 20 years. It's just on any given day.
Second longest liquidation sale.
Exactly. Hashtag world's second longest liquidation sale. So I think the broader strategy question really, and hopefully maybe companies have learned that they can do it if they have to. But the question is, how do you create that importance and immediacy every day? Make that part of your culture, not just when, the building's on fire, to go call the fire department, So
how do you galvanize the organization around crises that are less intense, but nonetheless pretty fundamentally important? In other words, they don't feel as intense in the moment, but they could lead to the ultimate demise of market share or the organization, right?
Yeah. Well, and it points a little bit to question number 4, which is, without starting to make aggressive changes in the immediate future, will you not only fail to thrive, but actually not survive? And I think what's happened with the COVID crisis has been a lot of folks or organizations and their leaders did see this existential crisis, right? It's like, if we don't figure out how to shift more of our business to online or do work from home or, go down the list of these things that we don't figure out how to do that now or tomorrow, we could be out of business. But how, and I'm not saying you can ever keep your organization at that level of urgency for an extended period of time. You'd burn out, I'm sure. But how do you get much closer to that level of urgency around things that are important but aren't necessarily going to put you out of business tomorrow or next month, but will eventually cause your demise?
Well, it gets to one point that you conclude that part of the book with whether you fight on price or fight on product, fight on service, fight on convenience, yes to all those or no to some. Really, it comes down to making only one choice, right? And that's the choice that you've got to be remarkable, because in a world where there's so much abundance of everything, price fighters, lots of product, great service, not so much of that these days, and convenience, you better be something over and above all of that, right? There's really effectively, you say, only one choice to make.
Yeah, I think it's when I've back in the good old days when I did keynote speeches.
Remember those?
On stages, remember those? I often violated probably what they teach you in keynote speaker school, though I've never gone to keynote speaker school, as people have seen me probably would know. But I had this big picture of the proverbial fork in the road, which is, you've got to pick a lane. What is really the problem is not committing That's the so-called death in the middle. And I think the strategic lane in these very simplistic terms is, do you want to try to go down the path to out Amazon, or out Walmart, and be all about, scale, scope, convenience, price? Or do you want to forge a different path? And for a few companies, taking that fork towards the more Amazon kind of model may be sensible. Maybe. But for most, that's not really a choice, because we're never going to be the low price leader. We're never going to have the kind of scale and supply chain and all that other good stuff.
You've got a quote in there from Seth, from our guest from episode 2, Seth Godin, who talks about, the problem with the race to the bottom is you might win, or you might come in second.
Right.
Great quote.
So it's a very big choice to make. So I think what I try to switch here as we're pivoting to part 2 is to say, okay, look, you have to pick a lane. Not picking a lane is almost guaranteeing your irrelevance. That slow motion crisis will eventually catch up with you. And 99% of you should probably pick the more, be special, not big, competing on price lane. A few, if you work at Costco, whatever, we can find some retailers where leaning into that left-hand turn is sensible. But for most, it's going to be to try to figure out how to really narrow your customer focus and go deep around a few things that can really make you remarkable.
Well, let's talk about the framework and lay it out for us in the 8 essentials of the ones. And we're not going to go through them in any kind of depth, but we do have 8 episodes ahead where we are, and we're going to have great guests, and it's going to be just a pile of fun. I mean, we were talking off mic about the guests coming up. The difference between the things that are you just got to do and those things that will make you clearly differentiated in the market.
We talked about, I think, in the initial episode, I developed this 8 essentials framework based upon my corporate work, senior roles at retailers, and then over the last 10 or so years through consulting assignments and doing research and so forth. And I found that these 8 essentials fit the vast majority of cases. But to your point, 6 of the 8 are increasingly becoming what I would call table stakes. That is, if you aren't pretty proficient at them, chances are that's a problem for you. And then the last 2 are really more differentiators. So to tick off the 6 that are table stakes, the first is digitally enabled. And I think this has really become much more obvious in the past 6 months, but it's this idea that so many customer journeys are enhanced by some sort of digital interaction. And obviously that can vary everywhere from being pure e-commerce to the way digital technology is helping sales associates to the way people are using mobile devices to inform their shopping journey. But fundamentally, I don't believe it's digital first necessarily, but I think this idea of most shopping journeys being enhanced, led, whatever term you want to use, by some form of digital technology is critical. 2 is human-centered, and this is just my twist on customer centricity, and I talk a little bit about why I think customer centricity initiatives have failed. But I think the 2 bigger ideas in this one is, number 1, we need to think more broadly in our business model than simply customers, that there are other folks that are involved in our success, most notably our sales associates, but certainly vendor partners, the communities in which we operate, and so forth. But the other part of human-centered is to really try to get into, for lack of a better term, kind of the difference between left brain thinking and right brain thinking. How do we get emotion more into the equation of how we solve business problems and meet our customer needs? Because, the fact of the matter is sometimes we're very rational and a lot of times we aren't. If anything, the COVID crisis has made this almost more clear, right? Because fundamentally being safe, right? That's you could argue that's very logical, but it's also a very just gut kind of biologically wired feeling that we have to be mindful of. 3 is harmonized, which is my term for omni-channel, where I try to get at that it's less about being everywhere for every customer, as omni tends to point to, but it's really about creating this harmonious experience, however the customer chooses to shop, whatever she might be buying, and whatever that path to purchase looks like. 4, and I think there's starting to be an argument, you could say, where almost 1 in 4 could be combined because so many shopping journeys now are informed or involve a mobile device. So some of that is the form in which we engage in our shopping process, but also it really changes the definition of a best location. Our brand is showing up so often wherever the customer happens to be, and they can be shopping in a nanosecond, basically, if they choose to, and they can go from our store to someone else's store, obviously in a pretty seamless way, and often do. 5 is personal. It's deliberately not called personalized. That's part of it, but it's this idea of really understanding our customers as deeply as we possibly can and really evolving our business model to be intensely customer relevant. So I get into a little bit of the kind of customer research, data analytics, leverage piece of this, but also things like personalized marketing and customized product and curation that's informed by a deep understanding of the customer and what makes us relevant. The last one in the table stakes, number 6, is connected. Again, this also has a bunch of layers, but it really fundamentally is about how we're in this kind of boundaryless world, not only from a kind of supply chain standpoint and devices being connected through the Internet of Things, but the way we are connected as individuals and tribes through social media and all sorts of other ways, basically facilitated by the Internet. So those are the 6. And yeah, I do have a hard time as I look through now at lots of businesses of seeing if you aren't pretty decent at some of these, you're probably falling behind. There certainly are opportunities for some retailers to excel here.
So then we get to the essentials, and of the essentials, the ones that allow you to differentiate. So tell me about those, memorable and radical.
Yeah, so number 7 is memorable, and this is the one that probably aligns the best with just the general notion of being remarkable or how people tend to understand it, though I try to explain how all 8 essentials are part of that equation. But memorable is what is that thing that we do, that story we create for the customer that they tell themselves or they will tell to others to literally remark to people? What are we doing to create that memory and that story? I both explain what I think the components of memorable are. So those are things like being distinctive, intensely customer relevant, authentic, really this idea of amplifying the wow, what's really that thing that stands out, super distinctive and you might share. But then I also go into a lot of different strategies because this is where it gets harder to apply some of these principles broadly, because in an industry as diverse as retail, particularly if you want to include things like restaurants and other things that are kind of retail-ish, there are a lot of different strategies. So I go through about a dozen different ways that different companies are being remarkable, in some case examples. And then radical is mostly about what it takes to be consistently innovative, to build a culture of experimentation. What are those ingredients that allow you to have a repeatable formula to not only be remarkable today, but continue to be remarkable in the future? So
let's talk about a framework around the framework to pile on the idea here. Can you imagine a world where folks are listening and they go, okay, in 2021, we'll take on human-centered, 2022, we'll take on harmonized, and so forth and so on. You can almost see, people exploding each of those pieces of the pie, so to speak. But you took a different approach. You said, listen, as you're listening to this, here's 5 kind of, framework on the framework as you listen and think about your own context. Take us through those.
Yeah, well, what I guess the general advice I give, and some of this it's very hard, kind of as what I was alluding to before, when you're talking about an industry as diverse as retail, this kind of one-size-fits-all prescription, I think, isn't particularly helpful.
But if you're running a retail banking product and you're sitting in marketing and strategy, you're not having dissimilar thoughts. So to your point, I actually see this framework far beyond just the context of retail as we all think about selling a good to a consumer, right?
Yeah,
or even B2B, right?
Yeah, I think if you've got a consumer, certainly if you get a consumer-facing business, most of these principles would apply, restaurant, hotel, banking, et cetera, where you've got the merging of digital and probably some sort of in-person experience. So I absolutely agree. But it is hard to give this kind of one-size-fits-all prescription. The other thing is certainly some companies that may be reading this might be pretty good at a lot of this, and others may be really behind.
Should they rank themselves, Steve? Like, if you're sitting in a boardroom and you've got your book, everybody's got a copy of their book on their in front of them at a boardroom and say, okay, so should they get out pens and paper or sticky notes and say, who thinks we're at a scale of 1 and 10, who thinks we're a 10 on these or a 5 on these? Like, is there a process you have in mind?
I mean, I've done that. I mean, there are a bunch of different ways to do it, but I've done that with clients. And I think, the invitation I talk about at the outset of part 2 is to look at all of the 8 essentials. And you absolutely could do this with your team on a whiteboard. Just list each of them. And then ask yourself or assess yourself on these 5 questions or kind of maturity criteria, I guess you could say. But number 1 is, how relevant is the particular essential to achieving remarkable outcomes for your core customers? So you could do that 1 to 5, very high, whatever. Number 2 is, what is your current organization's level of distinctiveness on each? Number 3 gets to the problem is you think you have time thing we talked about earlier is, how urgent is it for you to close the gap if you're behind, or extend or create a lead if you're more in a parity situation? The 4th is the degree to which progress on each of those 8 essentials or any of those 8 essentials would have a material impact on your results. Because, you could be behind and pretty distinct, but it might not be a big lever for your particular business for whatever reason. And then the 5th, which hopefully helps a little bit with resource prioritization, is, okay, what's the level of difficulty to achieve the desired impact? So you could look at that in terms of cost, complexity, capital. Maybe you've got some cultural barriers that, okay, this is really going to be hard. And so maybe you need to work on changing your team before you prioritize this or getting help. So I think, absolutely. You can go through each of the essentials and do an informal ranking. But then I think you can step back and say, okay, where should we start? And I did with a client a few weeks ago where we did this exercise, and it was pretty clear they had 2 of the essentials to do the most work on. Those were the things that were the most urgent and had the biggest chance to really make a difference, short-term and long-term. There are a bunch of others that, it would be nice to make some progress, but we only have so many people. We only have so much money. We've got to map out this roadmap. So I think that's really the key, at least initially, is to do a high-level roadmap, and that will point you to which of these areas where you really need to do one or more areas where you might need to do a deep dive.
Is there any one of those that you experience amongst your clients or in your personal experience, the most difference of opinion amongst executives? So I look at them and I look at number 3, the urgency to close the gap would feel to me like you'd have a potentially very big difference of opinion at a table. Is there anyone that jumps out at you as consistently being, wow, we really got 2 minds in the same room here?
I don't know that there's one. I mean, I probably would say urgency if I had to pick one. But it really varies quite a lot. I mean, I think just in general, and I know we touched on this in an earlier episode, and I go to it in some more depth, is, sometimes you have organizations that just are so internally focused that they don't even really have an understanding about how dire their circumstances are and what would be involved. In other cases, you've got organizations that have studied a ton and run all these different scenarios, but they're afraid to pull the trigger on anything. In other cases, their definition of improvement looks pretty easy to them. When, if you were to do it more from a customer and competitive standpoint, you would go like, actually you have a lot more work to do and that's a lot more expensive. I always think it's great to, not that this is an original idea, but there's an aspect of getting your facts in order, right? And having the clearest view of the situation. But, if you can't see clearly, even with all the facts, and your organization is not positioned to act, then you can still really get hung up. So I think it's complex, but I think if you're honest about going through this kind of high-level diagnostic and you ask yourself where there is disagreement, okay, what is at the root of our disagreement, and can we bring any more facts to bear? Or, just ultimately as the CEO say, look, okay, I've heard this. Now we're going to go. Obviously different organizations have different decision-making processes. The other thing, which is a question you didn't ask, but, the other thing I think that can really help illuminate, whether you use the 8 essentials framework specifically or not, is just to do a much better job of customer journey mapping. And I found time and time again that some of the organizations that are doing very well have been engaged in that work for quite some time. And those that are drifting, or in some cases in very serious trouble, really haven't done that work. And some of that speaks to whether they are fundamentally customer driven, data driven, et cetera. But some of that is they haven't been paying enough attention to realize how much, and this is not a COVID comment. I mean, that just adds another layer to it. But they haven't realized how much customer journeys have changed. How many of them may start on a smart device, right? Or how many might start in product search on Amazon, not going to their website or whatever. Like there's a bazillion different ways customer journeys have changed. But if they think that that core customer they've had for years is still shopping the same way, chances are they're not. Probably more importantly, the customers they need in the future to acquire or to grow their share of wallet probably shop a lot differently than the customer that was driving their business 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
And the biggest delta I've experienced in that realm with my clients has been the degree to which they're mobile first.
Yeah.
The role of mobile, I think, is often understated or at least underappreciated. And I got one last question on this whole strategic planning process. I've been in two different organizations. In one room, they really care ranking against the competitor. So the competitor, lots of competitor analysis, less so on the customer journey. And I've been in another room and they said, well, I don't really care what the competitor is doing. We're going to do our own thing. Let's just understand what the customer wants. Is there a single truth to that? Or is it a bit of approach, or should it be a little bit of both? Like, I guess my question is, how important is what all your competitors are doing to your planning using a strategic framework like this?
First of all, I would never say it's unimportant not to understand what your competitors and your customers are doing. One of the other quotes I have in the book is that from Henry Ford, who said, if I'd asked customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So customers aren't always going to lead you to the next great thing. This whole idea of best practices, which I think is maybe not exactly what you were getting at, but there's a lot of effort and a lot of consultants that push the idea of, we got to understand best demonstrated practices among our competition. I guess I look at that as input that can inform your strategy. But if you're just copying the best practice, it's not necessarily giving you an advantage. Again, it gets a little bit to the table stakes and differentiator. That can help you understand what's a table stake now or could be in the near future, but it doesn't necessarily get you to that next thing. It's input, but I'm a little bit more of a fan of human-centered design as a way to unlock some breakthrough technology. But all of this has to be done in the context of what the customer might be ready for, or where he or she is moving.
Where there's some pick a phrase, the blue ocean strategies, where is there some place to go that is underserved, and understanding the market, the consumer, and the competitor all at the same time, right?
Yeah, one of the things I think is interesting, and I've been thinking a little bit more about, and I was in a conversation with a partner at a big consulting firm about this, is just the degree to which customer segments are fragmenting. For the most part, a lot of the big brands, retailers, you name it, over the last few years have gotten there by being really good at kind of serving the peak of the bell curve. Part of what the internet has allowed for and what certain venture capitalists have been willing to fund are these interesting little kind of subsegments where somebody's taken a very particular problem and developed it's still a niche business. And I think what's instructive about that, I think sometimes for bigger brands, is to say, what is it about this particular brand? Is it, I don't know, Bombas and socks, or Quip and toothbrushes or something? What is it about some of these brands? What have they unlocked? Have they just picked off 1% of our business? That's all it's going to be? Or is that speaking to a broader trend? And I don't...
The Warby Parker question, right? It's like, how many people are going to shop there? They've just, they're still going to buy their eyeglasses where they get their eyes tested, I'm sure. Or maybe not.
Well, I wish I could tell you that I have figured out a precise formula to... so I have a client that refers to some of these brands as mosquito brands. Like they're annoying, and you've got to sort of pay attention to them, but they're really not going to kill you.
Mosquito in the tent.
And I think it's hard to know. I think you can certainly, with the benefit of hindsight, look back at some of these brands that were never going to scale above, even getting aside from just the ridiculous amount of money they spent on marketing and so forth. But you can say, okay, that's a $50 million idea, not a $5 billion idea.
Casper's always brought up in that kind of line of thinking, right? It's like, there's such a big trend. They're really still a fairly small part of the overall mattress industry.
Well, it's worth, I think, getting into what you think the potential addressable market is for some of these ideas, and do they get to any kind of real escape velocity, or do they really impact you all that significantly? So I think that's a worthwhile exercise. And Casper in particular, I mean, the economics of that business are pretty terrible in the way they've gone about it. So we'll see what happens there. There can be death by 1,000 cuts too, right? I mean, you can say if you're the big mattress guys, well, gee, they're only going to take 5% of the business. If that 5% of the business represents 20% of your profits, that may be a problem, particularly if you are unwilling to compete with yourself, or your response is just to lower your prices to compete, to protect, 5% or 10% of your business. So there's a lot of complicated factors, I think, in dealing with these insurgent brands. But again, that gets to really understanding what they're doing. And is that just a mosquito annoying thing and you don't want to chase your tail? Or is this revealing something about something you have to protect? Or maybe it's a source of innovation, because most of those brands that are worth paying attention to, that have particularly some of these digitally native vertical brands. I mean, nothing prevented a lot of these big companies from creating a competing business, right? I mean, LensCrafter could have created 10 years ago.
And has, right?
They have now, right?
Yeah, they bought them, yeah.
The problem is, I think, with some of these remarkable brands that actually have enduring properties, and so there's still a lot, I think, is Casper an enduring brand or not? I think, you got to be careful that you don't, again, it's this issue of, do you have time or not? Because if Warby Parker, just to stay with that example, they're valued now at over $3 billion. We'll see what happens with that valuation. But in terms of being an acquisition target, it's gotten pretty rich for some of the folks that might have wanted to acquire them. And if Warby Parker is just going to clear the market on the particular type of customer that wants that, like, the last thing you want to do is just create a Warby Parker wannabe. That'll probably be a waste and just dilute what you're doing with your core business. So there's a lot of questions that you have to answer, but it gets back to, doing the homework, really accepting what this can mean for your business, and then being willing to take aggressive action before it is too late for you to catch up or develop your own fighting brand.
If you like what you heard, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, your favorite podcast platform, so you can catch up with all our great interviews, like our discussion with Seth Godin on what retailers can actually do to fight climate change. New episodes of Season 5, presented by Marketal, will show up each and every week. And be sure and tell your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us.
And I'm Steve Dennis, author of the best-selling book, Remarkable Retail: How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant, keynote speaker, and producer and host of a series of retail trade podcasts, including this one, plus the host of the popular YouTube cooking show Last Request Barbecue. You can learn even more about me on LinkedIn or meleblanc.co. Safe travels, everyone.